I actually don't need the microphone, but I'm going to go ahead and use it. So, hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Catherine Statler, Professor of History and Element Chair for Collaborative Research at the Humanities Center. And I want to welcome you to this very special and prestigious event in our semester's programming, the Knapp Lecture, delivered today by our distinguished guest, Dr. David Clough, right over here. The Knapp Chair of Liberal Arts was established in 1995 by a generous endowment from the estate of Mary and Churchill Knapp of La Jolla, California, longtime supporters of the College of Arts and Sciences here at USD. Knapp chairs are distinguished teacher scholars who are appointed by the dean and represent the arts and humanities, natural sciences and mathematics, and social sciences. The Knapp chairs contribute to the vitality and centrality of liberal arts in the college by teaching and interacting with students, collaborating with faculty, and presenting public lectures, such as this one, that engage our campus community in confronting humanity's urgent challenges. Along those lines, brief announcement here, please join us after the lecture for the launch reception for the Center for Food Systems Transformation. You go right out that door at the end and into the hallway, so I hope you will join us. And now, to introduce our current Knapp Chair, please welcome Professor of Theology and Religious Studies, Aaron Gross.
It's really a delight to be here. Thanks so much for coming. And I also want to especially thank the Humanities Center, Brian and Lindy, for just the tremendous support that has made David Visits a success, and especially for tonight. David's visit is also connected with the Center for Food System Transformation, which you just heard will have that reception afterwards. And in introducing David, it's also going to give me a little bit of a chance to introduce you to the Center for Food Systems Transformation. It was literally the first thing that I and a group of colleagues did when we learned that the center was being created, was apply to bring David here as a Knapp chair, and delighted that it got accepted, and here we are. David is the chair of Theology and Applied Sciences at the University of Aberdeen. He is a well-known Christian ethicist who is particularly known for his work on our relationship with the more than human world. His work is pretty widely taught in the UK in seminaries where Christian ethics is discussed. I personally know about half a dozen scholars here in the US who also use his work. So he's managed to speak about these issues in a way which has really captured people's attention and been heard. He's also been effective at making those ideas practical in the actual kind of context of a nation state. He received a $700,000 grant from the British government, which ultimately resulted, after a couple of years of hard work, in a Christian framework for farm animal welfare, which is now being widely used throughout the UK. His principal contribution is a 2-volume book series called On Animals. The first volume being a systematic theology, and the second volume being a theological ethics. And in briefly describing the difference between systematic theology and theological ethics, I can actually say a lot about why we wanted David here and what I hope the center will do. So Christian theologians have these subspecializations. A systematician is asking really big fundamental questions, like what is the nature of creation? What is the nature of redemption? And so that's what David did in his first volume on animals, really reflecting on the fundamental Christian doctrines and what they said about our relationship with the natural world. But then he moved into another specialty. So theological ethics is a subspecialty within theology where you really focus on the practical implications. What do we do? How does this impact our lives? How much should we inconvenience ourselves for X or Y? And that is the second volume. He addressed those questions. And the power of what David does is really the connection between these two, thinking very deeply about the values and then bringing them into the pragmatic challenge. And that is fundamentally what I understand the transformation in the name of the center to be about, having our values transform what we do in the world. In a couple days, we're going to have the American Academy of Religion here in San Diego. About 10,000 scholars from all over the world will be here. As far as I know, that's the largest gathering of scholars of religion in the world. One of the past presidents of the American Academy of Religion, David Gushee, had this to say about David's book project. Every so often, a book is produced that sets the standard for all other work in a field. This is one of those books. One more detail before I hand it over to David. Another thing I really appreciate about his work on food and on animals is the way it opens up into questions of racial justice. He's very sensitive to the racialized nature of our food system, and that's reflected in the folks who have been moved by his theological work. Willie Jennings, a black theologian at Yale University, described his book as a redefining moment for how we should teach theology and live with our animal king. David Clough.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, but thank you in particular for the invitation to spend 3 weeks with you, which I've really enjoyed. That time's just coming to an end. As you can imagine, it was quite a hard call to have to exchange the dark and gloom of Aberdeen in November for San Diego, but heroically I've made it through and managed to endure the blue skies and the sunshine over the last 3 weeks, so thanks very much for having me. And it's been really lovely to be in conversation with many of you over the course of the last few weeks in classes and in lectures and in workshops. And I've really enjoyed that and look forward to a further opportunity to be in conversation this evening. So beyond the standard Western diet, why fixing global food systems requires a new confrontation with animal agriculture. Let us be clear. Our current diet is killing us, killing vast numbers of domesticated and wild animals, and killing our shared environment. It's hard to change our diet individually, domestically, institutionally, nationally, and globally. But unless we find the means to do so, we face an acceleration of the harms that follow from the destructive trajectory of the food systems in which we are active participants. Worsening human health and disease, human food insecurity, human water insecurity, injustice to food workers, environmental racism, farmed animal suffering, wild animal extinction, air and water pollution, and weather extremes from a changing climate all follow from food business as usual. And food business as usual will continue unless citizens like us withdraw the social license to operate required by the huge corporations that dominate global food systems, and until we demand something different. That's the bad news. Delivering bad news is why you invite ethicists to campuses, right? But here's the good news. While the problems with global food systems are similar to other existential threats to human and more than human life on Earth in their fearsome scale and the difficulty we feel in locating levers for change, food is different from those other challenges in one key way. Food is also ordinary, everyday, individual, and domestic. Food is the most intimate relationship we have with other creatures. Sometimes we say that food is fuel for our bodies, but it's so much more than that. Living creatures like us build our bodies, our very souls, from the stuff of other creatures. Eating is a physical connection between ourselves and the wider creaturely world. So the good news is that making decisions about what we eat, individually and corporately, is an opportunity to embody, literally, a new and better relationship between ourselves and the wider world of creatures with whom we share this planet. Now, we are not going to solve the climate crisis or dismantle factory farming on the basis of what we decide to have for dinner tonight. But our choices about food, those choices of our families and friends, and the choices of the institutions in which we participate, such as this university, are a unique opportunity to bring harmony between our practice and our beliefs and values about what it means for humans to live well alongside other creatures. Our ordinary, everyday lives are the space in which we live out our beliefs and values. So our food practice is a unique opportunity to resist the appalling destructive power of food business as usual. It's also always an actual practical step that interrupts food business as usual, because our consumption is the demand that determines decisions about what gets produced. That's what motivates me to get up each day and look squarely in the face of the many evils in our current food systems. What we decide to eat both embodies our beliefs and values and makes a practical difference. So here are the terms of my invitation to you this evening. I invite you to take a little time to pay attention with me to the realities of how current food systems operate in ways that inflict devastating destruction on human and more than human lives. If you've not considered the full scope of these issues before, I expect you to be shocked and alarmed. I invite you to this demanding engagement, not because my aim is to shock and alarm you, but because I think more people becoming well informed about how modern food systems operate is crucial for the possibility of change. And shock and alarm are appropriate responses to getting better informed about the operation of industries that have made strenuous efforts to hide their inner workings and impacts from citizens and consumers. Becoming better informed is crucial, but that's not an end in itself either. I'd like you to accept the invitation to follow me on the journey of this lecture, not just because you'll leave with a better understanding of the issues that confront us, but because there are practical actions you can take on the basis of this knowledge, as individuals and as members of institutions such as this university, that can make a difference. Okay, so what's going on with current food systems? I want to introduce you to three key areas of the problems with global food systems in the order that I encountered them in my academic research. Impacts on animals, impacts on our shared environment, and impacts on humans. So let's start with animals. So this was the first door I opened. I think as a teenager I became increasingly sensitized to examples of animal suffering around me. And I began to learn more about how we were treating animals as we were farming them for food. Farmed animals are the fellow creatures most directly affected by factory farming, of course. And my sense is that a significant reason that we tolerate modern farming practice is that we have an image of animal farming which is something like this one from a child's picture book. And I don't especially blame Felicia Bond. I'm sure she was following a particular design brief. But I think we still carry in our imaginations this kind of sense about what animal farming is like. And so to get an understanding of what farming is actually like, we need to disabuse ourselves of this kind of picture. The animal most numerously farmed for food by an order of magnitude, several orders of magnitude, are fish. About half of global fish consumption now comes from farmed environments. A former colleague of mine at the University of Chester, Lynn Snedden, did pioneering research on pain perception and sentience in fish. And I think it's now beyond reasonable doubt that fish suffer pain and have the physiological apparatus to suffer and be aware of that suffering. And that's a problem both in relation to farmed environments, where we're raising fish without any regard to their preferred environments, in sort of bare tanks on land and in crowded sea cages for saltwater phases of their life. But it's also a problem for wild capture fisheries. So wild capture requires fish to experience compression injuries as they're being pulled out of the water, and then a slow suffocation on the decks of trawler vessels over 2 or 3 hours, slowed down by refrigeration. So we've got reasons to worry about the way we're using fish for food in farming and in wild capture environments. The second most numerous animal we use for food after fish are chickens, about 70 billion or so each year. And we've completely separated the uses we make of chickens for meat and for eggs. And so that's led to elaborate selective breeding processes. And broiler chickens, the kinds of chickens that are raised in indoor warehouses for meat, are the most extreme current example of the selective breeding of farmed animals to just make them more and more efficient units of production. So I visited one site where the production cycle started on day one with the delivery of 600,000 day-old chicks into 24 huge warehouses. And after I'd gone through biosecurity, I found myself in one of those warehouses and asked if I could pick up one of the chickens. I found myself standing in this warehouse of 24,000 birds with this one chicken in my hand of the 600,000 that had been delivered 16 days before. And what really struck me is this chicken was halfway through her life. So that broiler chickens used to take a year or two to grow to maturity, but we've selectively bred them so that they reach slaughter weight in 35 or 40 days. And that creates prematurely obese bodies and legs that find it very difficult to support this kind of lumbering mass, and so cause a great deal of suffering. So there's really serious concerns about how we are treating chickens raised for meat. Because we completely separate the breeding of chickens for meat and eggs, if you take a moment, you realize that if you're breeding chickens to lay eggs, that means that half of the chickens born, or the males, are a redundant byproduct. And so they're discarded. One humane method approved in the US and in the UK is maceration, which is literally dropping day-old chicks into a grinding machine. Sometimes chicks are just bagged up in plastic sacks instead. And then the sisters of those male chicks have a laying life of about 18 months before they're culled for food. You're probably aware California has taken the good step of banning cages for laying hens, but the vast majority globally are still farmed in these kinds of battery cages. I think about the most traumatic farm site visit I've ever been on was going to see intensive pig production. I still remember walking into a sort of a warehouse with a set of pens in which there were each probably about 20 pigs, 5 or 6 feet long at the time I was seeing them, and it was a kind of screaming environment with pigs sort of clambering over each other. There was hardly enough room for them all to stand up simultaneously in their sty, and they'd had their tails docked because these are cognitively have capacities similar to dogs. They have a very complex social life given opportunities, and so the lack of enrichment means that they would be chewing on each other over their sort of 6 to 9 month life. Then if we move on to cattle, again we've separated out raising cattle for dairy and for meat. And feminist authors like Carol Adams have pointed out the particular feminist reasons we might have for being concerned about what's being done to female animals like dairy cows. So repeatedly forcibly inseminated, made pregnant, they give birth to their calves, the calves are taken away, and then they produce milk for a period before that whole cycle starts again. And you may be aware about really nasty maternal deprivation studies done on chimpanzees in the US over a period of decades, which unsurprisingly found very serious consequences of taking a mammal away from their mother in terms of maternal and infant experience. And I think we're doing that maternal deprivation on a mass scale in industrial dairy production. And then finally, cattle raised for beef. This is an image of a feedlot in Texas where about 40,000 cattle are being finished, which is being sort of fed intensively, not on grazing grass, but on high energy feed, and they're also fed growth hormone. One of the worries in the UK post-election is that the US will use the threat of tariffs to force the UK to accept imports for the first time of hormone-raised beef and chlorine-washed chicken, which are currently not permitted for import in the UK. So we need to get our heads around, in terms of the impacts on farmed animals, we need to get our heads around the picture book image we have of farming is long gone in almost all cases, and 99% of animal products currently on sale in the US come from these factory farming systems, which have zero regard for the flourishing of farmed animals. And here's what it looks like locally. So this is a fairly recent map of the intensity of factory farms in the US. The purple patch you can see around north and south of Fresno is the most highest density of factory farming. And in California, as you're probably aware, that's about dairy cows. Dairy production in California has trebled in the last 25 years or so. California is now producing more milk than Wisconsin. About 20% of the global supply of milk comes from the US. And so that's just a local example of the kind of enormous shifts in animal agriculture. So impacts on farmed animals, as I say, were the first thing that led me into thinking about this topic. But what it took me a while to realize is that what we're doing in relation to animal agriculture is also a huge problem in relation to the current mass extinction crisis of wild animals that we're currently living through. And that's because the land required to support the vast populations of farmed animals, so currently 96% of the mammal biomass on Earth is either humans or is humans plus domesticated animals, only 4% wild mammals. So we've got this huge monopolistic impact on the Earth. And that means there's the land required to graze animals and to grow fodder crops for animals combined is pushing wild animals further and further and depriving them of habitat. And the expansion of agricultural land is the biggest driver of habitat loss, and that has caused declines of 69% in the populations of wild animals since 1970. Let's move on. Beyond the impacts on domestic and wild animals, there are also impacts that are becoming better known in relation to our shared environment. And so there's a lot of attention to consumption of animal products at the moment on the basis of carbon emissions. And estimates vary, but around 15% of global carbon emissions come from animal agriculture. And even if we managed to eliminate all other sources of carbon from every other industry, we would bust through our net zero targets if we didn't address emissions from animal agriculture. So that's a big deal. Greenhouse gas emissions from beef are 150 times that of getting the same nutrition from soy crops. And even the least efficient emissions-intensive meat products produce about 20 or 25 times as much emissions as the most efficient plant-based sources. So we need to be concerned about climate. We also need to be concerned about pollution as a key environmental issue. So vast populations of farmed animals produce vast amounts of waste. And from factory farms, they are pumped into manure lagoons, which you may be unfortunate enough to be familiar with. And those lagoons produce concentrations of ammonia in the air, and discharge often escapes into water supplies. And you won't be surprised to learn that the people who end up living close to these factory farms, this isn't an evenly spread burden across the United States. And this is one aspect of where environmental racism is linked to animal agriculture, because the people who live close to these sites are disproportionately people of colour, disproportionately native, disproportionately migrant, and obviously disproportionately on lower incomes. And people talk about the horror of having to send their children to school smelling of, and apologise, shit. Because of what it means to live close to these environments. Before I came to San Diego on this trip, I spent a couple of days at Baylor University in Waco, which I hadn't visited before. And so before one of my class visits there, I just did a quick bit of research on what was going on in relation to animal agriculture in Waco. And I found that for decades, Waco lawmakers had been fighting an unsuccessful battle trying to regulate the waste from intensive dairy production on the North Bosque River, which flows into Lake Waco, which provides drinking water for about 170,000 people. And it was really clear from the history that was not only had not been terribly successful, but was also getting worse, because big meat companies had been lobbying Texas legislators at a state level to further deregulate the industry and make it harder and harder for factory farms to be held to account. I appreciate you can't see all of the detail on this chart, but I think this is a really helpful mapping of how food choices impact on a variety of environmental issues from a Lancet article a few years ago. And so at the top, we've got, down the left-hand side, we've got different food groups, starting with ruminant meat, pork, chicken, fish, dairy, eggs. So those are animal products at the top. And at the bottom, we've got plant-based foods. And then each column is, first of all, greenhouse gas emissions, then land use, then energy use, then acidification potential, and then eutrophication potential. So that's the enrichment of watercourses with nutrients that then make rivers bad for native species and for humans. And so you don't actually need to see the detail to recognize that the biggest impacts are all gathered at the top of each of those columns. And so if we want to pay attention to environmental impacts of what we're eating, we need to recognize that what we need to pay attention to is meat, chicken, fish, dairy, and eggs. And so that's a very good indication of how animal agriculture is a significant problem in relation to a whole range of environmental issues. And then finally, let's come on to human impacts. And the most direct human impacts start with the workers in food systems. And I think we often forget about human workers in meat processing plants. These are among the most dangerous jobs in America, twice the injury rate of construction. And what you have to picture is, say, in a farm, a meat processing plant that's processing broiler chickens, you have to picture a fixed line rate with birds going past at 140 birds per minute is the supposed legal maximum. The USDA is currently running what they call a pilot project, which allows any meat processing plant to experiment with faster line rates than the maximum that's supposed to be agreed by calling it a pilot project. But if you imagine being a worker in that system, you've got sharp tools, you're trying to do your particular job on that production line next to shoulder with other people with sharp tools, desperately trying to keep up with this fixed line rate. It's completely unsurprising that workers suffer very high rates of physical and mental injury from working in those conditions. And again, those jobs are obviously not evenly distributed. 40% of workers in those plants are Latinx. and disproportionately those workers are female, migrant, and undocumented. And when Australia tried to bring in stricter immigration policies, the first industry to cry foul was the meat packing plants, who said that we won't have people to slaughter and process the animals if you implement policies like these. So watch that space. A second impact on humans is non-communicable diseases. Obviously, the primary purpose of human food systems is to provide nutrition for humans. But there are problems here, both in relation to deficit, so about 800 million people on the planet were undernourished in 2021, but particularly in relation to excess. So now more deaths globally are linked to being overweight than, or obese than being underweight. And here's another graphic. I appreciate, again, you can't see all of the detail, but you can see what we're looking at the top is global issue of obesity and health problems in relation to obesity, and at the bottom, health problems in relation to malnutrition. And you can see around about 2000, this is done in disability-adjusted life years. By the time we got to 2000, those were pretty even. But since 2000, the problems from disability-adjusted life years has increased significantly from obesity. So we definitely need to be paying attention to malnutrition on a continuing basis. There's famines in Gaza and Darfur that we ought to be concerned about, among other places now. But if we're thinking about food systems globally, we need to recognize that obesity is the bigger cause of illness, disability, and disease. And so we need to pay attention to that in particular. And it's also the case that the Western diet is now not restricted to Western countries. So inflammatory, cardiovascular, metabolic, malignant diseases in China have increased dramatically over the past 30 years. That trend is observable in the Americas and older people across the world. WHO estimates that non-communicable diseases kill 41 million people each year, which is equivalent to 74% of all deaths globally. So we need to really seriously think about the way that diet is affecting deaths. And this is just another graphic showing the range of non-communicable diseases linked to our current dietary patterns: stroke and brain disease, myocardial infarction, heart disease, obesity, diabetes, and so on. We then need to think about communicable diseases. And here's another current story in relation to California. When I checked for a class last Tuesday, I found a notification on California Agriculture Organization saying that about 234 dairy farms in California they'd found cattle with H5N1 bird flu. So H5, the bird flu starts in intensive poultry production, has escaped to wild avian populations, but now novelly is present across the United States in dairy cattle. In California, it's having having worse outcomes. About 20% of the cattle are dying. And I kept checking back for classes that I were teaching. When I checked just this afternoon, that number is now above 300. So there's a rapid increase. And about 27 people in California have caught H5N1 bird flu from dairy cattle. And there's an increasing worry that a particular case of bird flu in Canada is showing an ability to cross the boundary to allow human-to-human transmission. So we need to be scientists are very, very concerned about the way in which factory farms are the ideal environment for breeding new pathogens, which represent serious threats to human health. Other human illnesses originate from poor hygiene in meatpacking plants. Most E. coli infections are from allowing animal excrement to come into contact with meat. Campylobacter, Listeria, Salmonella, and parasites are also transmitted in that way. And then a final issue in relation to communicable disease is that currently we're feeding about 84% of antibiotics in the United States to farmed animals, about 80% of which is to promote growth rather than to treat active infections. And so there's a serious worry about a growing antimicrobial resistance and our ability, the threat of running out of antibiotics because of how we're doing factory farming. Now, when I started researching this, I thought, well, things are pretty bad in relation to farmed animals, wild animals, and environment in relation to our food systems. But presumably people are proceeding with these global food systems because this is what's necessary in order to feed a growing human population. But it turns out that modern animal agriculture is not even delivering on that. In fact, it's a net threat to human food security. And I was just looking at recent statistics in relation to the US. And there's a study in 2013 which noted that the US at that point was using 67% of the total calorie production of crops to feed to animals. And so only 34%, it's very wasteful to do that, because if you feed crops to animals and then eat the animals rather than using the land to grow crops yourself, the efficiency is about 10% compared to the direct consumption. And so only 34% of calories produced in the US are actually delivered to the food system because of that serious waste. And researchers estimate that if you switched to growing food exclusively for direct human consumption, globally, available food calories could be increased by 70%. And so you could feed an additional 4 billion people, which is significantly in advance of the population growth that is expected. So human food security, even if you cared about none of the other things that I've talked about up to this point, human food security would be a reason seriously to question current patterns of animal agriculture. And then finally, there's a similar problem in relation to water security. Producing a kilogram of beef requires 20 times the water of producing equivalent nutrition from plants. Okay, so I've provided a very brief survey of key impacts of the way we are currently operating food systems in relation to production of animal products and their impacts on animals, environment, and human beings. Thank you for staying with me on that demanding journey. Obviously, there are other problems with global food systems. Hopefully, the new centre will have a chance to engage with them as well. But I hope I've convinced you, even with that brief survey, that modern food systems make use of industrial animal agriculture in ways that are having devastating consequences for the well-being of humans, animals, and the environment we share. Whenever I survey these multiple problems with modern food systems like this, I'm left with a question. If the operation of these systems is not conducive to the common good of humans and other creatures, and actually represents a net threat to human, animal, and environmental well-being, why are these systems operating? The answer is unfortunately simple and familiar. These systems continue to operate even though they aren't to the benefit of humans, animals, or the environment, because a few people are enriching themselves by their operations. Globally, the majority of animal agriculture is controlled by a very few huge companies. The Brazilian company JBS is the largest meat processing company in the world, with 150 industrial plants around the world. And together with other major multinational meat companies, Tyson Foods, Smithfield Foods, and Cargill, they exercise enormous control over markets and governments. Big agriculture employs some of the most well-resourced lobbyists in the world. In the US, they've successfully lobbied for ag-gag laws that make it illegal to let the public know what takes place inside factory farms and meat processing plants. They also lobby successfully against animal welfare and other food system reforms. And my experience at Waco was just a really powerful, worked example of how big ag and big meat manages to evade democratic controls, even when it's very clearly operating in ways that are not conducive to the common good. So, how should we respond? It's deeply frustrating to see powerful companies manipulating consumers and citizens, but I think there remains a powerful response in the hands of consumers in not supporting the operation of these companies by purchasing their products. And beyond that, there's the possibility of a powerful response open to citizens, which is withdrawing the social license to operate that these huge businesses require. In the time that I've spent on campus, as I say, I've really enjoyed the conversations I've had, and I've also really appreciated getting to know a little bit about the institution of the University of San Diego, and to find that you've done recent work on articulating your mission, vision, and core values. And it seems to me that those make clear that corporately you're already committed to specific aims that are at odds with supporting unjust food systems through your purchasing and consumption of food products. And that gives me hope that this university has the potential to light the way towards what it would mean for institutions to connect their mission with their food policy. So let me just take a minute or two to look through some key relevant points that I've spot in what you've already committed to in the 2023 revision of Mission, Vision, Core Values. So the mission includes the words of creating a more inclusive, sustainable, and hopeful world. The vision says we confront humanity's challenges by fostering peace, working for justice, and leading with love. And the core values specifically reference the 2015 papal encyclical on the environment, Laudato Si. The message of Laudato Si frames our care for creation. We integrate environmentally, economically, and socially responsible practices. And then under ethical conduct and compassionate service, we engage with the imminent issues of our time in order to enhance the common good. And our graduates are equipped to be innovative change makers, and it's been really good to be in classes where students are learning about what it would mean to make changes in relation to attention to the challenges that confront us. So with that reference to Laudato Si, that makes me want to ask, what might it mean to frame a care of our common home according to Laudato Si? One person I've really enjoyed getting better acquainted with over my time, 3 weeks on the campus, is St. Francis, whose statue is just outside in the Garden of the Sea, next to the lovely accommodation you've provided me with at Casa de la Paz. So St. Francis, it seems like, has been smiling down at me sort of each day as I walk past, which has been very encouraging. So obviously Pope Francis, the current Pope, chose his papal name to directly reference St. Francis of Assisi. And the encyclical Laudato Si begins with a Franciscan view of what it means to think about relationships with other creatures. And then I was struck by another Franciscan reference as well, San Diego de Alcalá, obviously for whom the city and the university are named as a Franciscan lay brother. And one of the famous stories about him was about him stealing bread from the monastery table in order to give to the poor. So I'm very struck by these local embedded references to thinking about food. So at the beginning of Laudato Si, Pope Francis says of Saint Francis, "Each and every creature was a sister united to him by bonds of affection. That's why he felt called to care for all that exists." And then Pope Francis says that idea of fellow creatures as sisters and brothers has a real impact in terms of how we think about our relationship with other creatures. He says, if we no longer speak the language of fraternity, brotherhood, and beauty in our relationship with the world, our attitude will be that of masters, consumers, ruthless exploiters. And so we've got a basic choice about seeing fellow creatures as siblings or positioning ourselves as masters, consumers, ruthless exploiters. And Pope Francis, in chapter 1 of the encyclical, identifies a range of environmental issues that he recognizes as of primary concern. And I hope it's clear from the survey that animal agriculture is implicated, though not unfortunately named clearly in the encyclical, is very clearly associated with all of the major headings that Pope Francis is identifying as challenges in relation to our environment. So I'm really encouraged to see that USD's mission, vision, and values have the capacity to recognize the problems with modern animal agriculture as something that the institution has reason to address in its practice in order to be true to the commitments it's made to create a more hopeful and sustainable world, confront current challenges, and integrate environmentally and socially responsible practices. It seems to me that individually and corporately, we have sleepwalked into complicity with systems of farming animals for which public consent was never sought. The strenuous efforts the huge meat companies make to ensure companies are kept in ignorance of their practices is a sign that they know if consumers knew what they were doing, they would not give that consent. As a Christian ethicist, my job is attending to how the traditions we have inherited bear upon key aspects of the world in which we find ourselves. When, as individuals or institutions, we discover tensions or contradictions between the values we profess and the realities of our practice, we are faced with a choice. We can find reasons not to act responsively and responsibly, or we can embrace the opportunity to change our practice to align with the kinds of persons or institutions we believe ourselves to be. And rereading Laudato Si just in the last few weeks, it seems to me that Pope Francis was very aware of that choice. Already in Laudato Si in 2015, he pointed out that obstructionist attitudes, even on the part of believers, I think that's quite an optimistic even there, obstructionist attitudes, even on the part of believers, can range from denial of the problem to indifference, nonchalant resignation, or blind confidence in technical solutions. He says we require a new and universal solidarity. And then 8 years on, in a follow-up letter called Laudato Deum, just last year, I think I detect a little bit more impatience in the Pope's remarks. He says, I've realized that our responses have not been adequate, while the world in which we live is collapsing and may be nearing the breaking point. We must move beyond the mentality of appearing to be concerned but not having the courage needed to produce substantial changes. And finally, we risk remaining trapped in the mindset of pasting and papering over cracks, while beneath the surface there is a continuing deterioration to which we continue to contribute. So what would it mean to avoid this obstructionism and be courageous in making a response that confronts the challenge that we've seen? The action we need is straightforward. We need to act to reduce and in time eliminate our economic support for industrial animal agriculture. This is demanding because, as I've said, 99% of animal products sold in the US are currently from factory farmed animals. We need a new normal, a new standard diet, and new food practices that are aligned with the kinds of people and institutions we believe ourselves to be. At an individual or domestic level, different people will find themselves very differently positioned. Some encounter the truths about modern animal agriculture and decide to make an immediate switch to a vegan diet. For others, it's harder to envisage that abrupt change, but they may begin with one meal, or one meal a day, or 1 day per week. In relation to change at an institutional level, here's some good news. Work is already well underway to find viable pathways to reducing consumption of animal products. Major campus caterers, such as Sodexo and Aramark, are already setting remarkably ambitious goals, aiming for around half of the meals they serve on hundreds of college campuses to be plant-based within the next couple of years, primarily motivated by their commitments to reduce carbon emissions and their awareness of demand from their consumers. Research trials have demonstrated that change on this scale can be achieved on campuses without impacting levels of student satisfaction by initiatives in relation to choice architecture, making plant-based options the default. So there's now a mainstream, road-tested, economically viable strategy for institutions like this one to make big changes in relation to aligning values and food practice. And there are parallel examples of good practice in relation to other kinds of institutions. For example, CreatureKind, the non-profit I co-founded in 2015, is working to encourage churches to establish plant-based defaults in their food practices for faith-based reasons. There are lots of examples about how to move forward in different contexts. The key question is whether there is the will to set aside the obstructionist tendencies Pope Francis identified and decide to make it happen. In the case of the University of San Diego, I'll be leaving shortly. So that's a question for you as students, faculty, managers, auxiliary services staff, alumni, board members, and other university stakeholders. I hope I've convinced you in this lecture that we need to find a new path forward in relation to the food we eat, individually and corporately. The standard Western diet is killing us, killing vast numbers of domesticated and wild animals, and killing our shared environment. A central part of the problem is the way in which modern animal agriculture functions, which means there's no path forward without a confrontation with animal agriculture. Moving beyond the standard Western diet and beyond our complicity with factory farming systems that are so devastating for humans, animals, and our shared environment means finding a life-giving route to a more inclusive, sustainable, and hopeful world. Taking action in relation to the food we consume is a profoundly hopeful act. We can't fix global systems by ourselves, but we can change our practice and that of the institutions we belong in order to embody our values in our everyday lives. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be with you and share this conversation, and I look forward to its continuation.